and welcome to The Point World Affairs. I'm Cha Sang-mi. Venezuela is facing a major political crisis in the midst of its worst ever economic downturn. Two presidents are currently engaged in a tug-of-war to take control over the poverty-stricken nation, with each leader being backed by a number of different countries across the globe. And to talk more about this, we have with us Dr. Ko Myung-an, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The restlessness of the Venezuelan people is at its peak as the country is hit by a severe economic crisis with an inflation rate of 10 million%. The angry public sentiment led to anti-government protests when President Nicolas Maduro, who is suspected of rigging the May presidential election, began his second term in office this year. The death toll is rising as Maduro is using violence to suppress the uprising. Amid the chaos, Juan Guaido, who is serving as the president of the National Assembly, declared himself an interim president on January 23rd.
Asumir formalmente las competencias del Ejecutivo Nacional.
Maduro, who is neck-deep in crisis, is looking to the military for backup, while Venezuela's opposition is also making efforts to use the military to oust Maduro.
Rodilla en tierra para derrotar el golpe de Estado. Le digo a toda la Fuerza Armada Nacional Bolivariana, máxima unión, máxima disciplina.
Y aquí, soldado venezolano, te hablo a ti. Es el momento de ponerse del lado de la Constitución. No es el momento del miedo. No es el momento de echar para atrás.
The Venezuelan military has so far remained loyal to Maduro, expressing support for the regime.
Contra la institucionalidad, contra nuestra democracia, contra nuestra constitución, contra el presidente Nicolás Maduro.
The international community is also split in light of Venezuela's political divide. The U.S. and the EU, which are in support of the interim leader, is seemingly in a proxy war with Russia and China, which support the current president.
Now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom, or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem.
Пользуясь присутствием госсекретаря Помпео, хотим прямо у него спросить, означает ли это, что США готовы применить военную силу против суверенного государства под надуманным предлогом?
Estados Unidos no está detrás del golpe de Estado, lo confieso. No está detrás del golpe de Estado. Está delante del golpe de Estado.
The U.S. and the EU, which are defining President Maduro as a dictator, are pressing for his resignation, while Russia and China are opposing external intervention from other countries. Why are their views so different? On this week's The Point World Affairs, we analyze the cause of Venezuela's political turmoil and why the international community is paying so much attention to the situation unfolding there.
So how did Venezuela end up finding itself with two presidents, now with Juan Guaido, who has declared himself an interim president, and the democratically elected president, Nicolas Maduro, who's being called right now to step down from his seat?
So actually the source of this crisis goes back to last year. Last year there was a presidential election. Nicolas Maduro was re-elected to his second term. But then that election has been called out to be fraudulent and then wasn't recognized by the United States or the European Union and many other countries because of the widespread electoral fraud. And then there was like an ongoing investigation in that regard, and also there was a political crisis after the election outcome. But then this year in January, President Maduro assumed this second term despite opposition from the public and the political sector. So what happened after that is that the president of the Venezuela's National Assembly, Juan Guaido, declared himself to be the acting president of Venezuela because he basically declared that Nicolas Maduro has been elected fraudulently, therefore he has no legitimacy, and because of the constitution written by Maduro's predecessor, Hugo Chavez, in 1999, the line of succession actually says that, if the president is declared to be illegitimate or invalid, then the successor has to be the president of the National Assembly, who is Juan Guaido. So based on that argument, Juan Guaido declared himself to the president of Venezuela. And then that's why we have two presidents in Venezuela at the moment.
It is not just the U.S. who is calling for some changes in this country, but actually the European countries as well, Germany, the U.K., they're also supporting Guaido on this issue. What do you think is the significance of the international community's acceptance of some country's president?
That's going to create a problem for the incumbent, Nicolas Maduro, because first of all, it has implications in the diplomatic sense. Many of the Venezuelan diplomats accredited to countries recognize Juan Guaido as the acting president. Their accreditation won't be valid anymore because the president that appointed them to this position has been, declared to be legitimate. So that's going to create diplomatic problem for the current Venezuelan government of Nicolas Maduro. And also it's going to have other implications in the economic sense because, for instance, the United States could declare that the assets controlled and owned by the Venezuelan state in the United States are going to be under the management of the acting president, Juan Guaido, not Nicolas Maduro. So in that sense, it's going to really constrain the foreign policy options of the Nicolas Maduro, as well as his economic influence in the country, because the people and the foreign investors are going to say that there's no hope or expectation to see their investment protected in Venezuela. So they're going to reduce the exposure to the Venezuelan economy. So it's going to really constrain the options for Nicolas Maduro.
I see we're going to come back to that diplomatic ties with other countries about this Venezuelan crisis after we connect to another expert.
The fundamental reason behind the chaotic political situation in Venezuela lies in its faltering economy. Venezuela was once the most affluent country in South America thanks to its oil resources. But reckless welfare policies and plunging oil prices have dealt a devastating blow to the country. According to the International Monetary Fund, Venezuela's inflation rate reached 10 million% in 2019. To buy just a kilogram of meat, one needs to carry around a suitcase full of cash, rendering monthly wages worthless. Meanwhile, the president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, who claimed himself as the interim president, appealed for humanitarian assistance from the international community to resolve the food and medicine shortages in his country. In response, the U.S., Canada, and the European Union pledged aid. But Maduro refused to let aid in, blocking the Tienditaz bridge so that the trucks were not able to enter.
Venezuela no es un país de mendigos, no somos mendigos de nadie. Todo lo que necesitamos.
He is staunchly against receiving assistance, claiming that the U.S. will eventually intervene in Venezuela's internal affairs in the form of humanitarian aid. Roughly 5 million people are estimated to have left Venezuela as of last year in an attempt to escape from the country's severe economic crisis. We continue our analysis on Venezuela with experts as they share what's behind Venezuela's economic collapse and the internal and external factors affecting Venezuela's economy.
To hear more about the current state in Venezuela, joining me now is Marianne Jimenez Morales, an expert in Latin American politics at University of Oxford. Thank you for being here, Marianne.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
A desperate humanitarian crisis in Venezuela is getting worse with widespread starvation. But while opposition leader Guaido has pledged to let the U.S. aid enter, Venezuelan President Maduro is blocking the act. So why is this?
Sure. So basically, this is a conflict of political interests and about regime stability. Juan Guaido is trying to get the humanitarian aid to sort of alleviate the suffering while the political crisis is being resolved, and this can take up to a few months, which is what he has said already. So the humanitarian aid for now is targeting the most vulnerable and the poorest of Venezuelans. He has said that there are around 300,000 Venezuelans are at the verge of dying, which is basically a huge humanitarian crisis, and that's why he is looking towards the coming in of this aid. Additionally, 87% of Venezuelans are suffering from poverty and 90% of shortages in medical supplies and also in food. So that's why before really the political crisis can be addressed and free and fair elections can take place, the Venezuelan society, basically the poorest of the society, need a little bit of help to overcome basically the situation and not die. So that's on the side of the opposition. Also, I want to stress here, I think it's really important that the opposition is not trying, at least this is my perspective, to politicize this. The opposition has tried to work with civil society, with organizations that have an expertise in the health sector to make this work.
Venezuela boasts the largest oil reserve in the world, but why is such country suffering from such economic meltdown, such as hyperinflation?
Sure, there are several factors in play. So Venezuela is a country that is called a petrostate. So this means that all the, basically most of the income is coming through the oil sector. That means, obviously, that a country such as Venezuela, as a petrostate, is very vulnerable to external shocks and external prices. So just to give you an idea, Venezuela has always been very reliant on its oil sector. However, this has changed largely over the past 20 years. While in the 1970s, for example, the income for basically the main income from the oil sector was around 70%. Today, the dependency on oil is much higher. So around 96% is actually coming from the oil sector. This means that basically when prices are high, the government or the state is getting a lot of funds. However, when prices fall, the government runs out of money. And this has happened consistently after the crash of the oil prices. So while the government has basically relied more on the oil sector, it has also gotten less money as the price of the oil was falling. Additionally, I think that what we have to highlight here is the mismanagement of basically the whole economy. But being an oil economy, it's very crucial to highlight the mismanagement of the oil company PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela. So we should recall that already in 2002, the government under Hugo Chavez fired over 20,000 skilled workers. So basically, the whole knowledge and know-how that was acquired to run a company like that, basically which gives the money, the country most of its input, was being run by people that didn't have the expertise. So this led to a mismanagement within the company that lasted or has been lasting for so many years. So around 16 years. So the mismanagement has also led to a reduction in production. So while in the 1990s, 3.2 million barrels were produced a day, today only 1.2 million barrels are produced a day. So this is basically a twofold problem. So prices have fallen, but also at the same time, production has fallen, which means that the government has less money. We could also think about the price controls and the currency controls that the government has exerted onto the Venezuelan economy. And this has led to a massive black market, which is also causing basically or contributing to the hyperinflation.
In order for us to understand the current predicament of Venezuela, I think we need to know the power structure there and the political system of the country. Tell us a little bit more about it. Where does the power lie in Venezuela, in its military or the National Assembly?
Right, so this is a really interesting question. The division of powers in Venezuela is very complicated. So Venezuela today counts as what we know as a failed state. This means that the state or the government doesn't control the whole territory and isn't capable of providing public goods to its citizens. This means that the ruling coalition is divided into several pieces. So while under government of Chavez had a control effectively over the military and the civilian side of the coalition, this is not so much so under Maduro. So he has had to give up a lot of power and a lot of power sharing to the military to gain their support. So that is why we can say basically that the Venezuelan government today is a de facto military regime, even though Maduro is civilian. So the military is a crucial actor because A, they control the force, so they are the only ones who can actually enact a war if they want it. And secondly, they control all key ministries in Venezuela. So for example, the food supply, the supply of medical goods, it's all in the hands of the military. Additionally, they're also active in illicit businesses, such as drug trafficking, illicit mining, human trafficking, etc. So this makes the military a powerful actor that not only controls a lot of resources, but also basically is capturing the possibilities of transitioning to democracy. So military officers so far don't have as many incentives to flip because they are in this whole illicit businesses.
Thank you very much. That was Marianne Jimenez Morales from Oxford. Now, Dr. Go, what did you think about her analysis? Also, there is definitely an economic difficulty behind all this meltdown. And we hear a lot of horrific stories, what the citizens are going through every day, how professional women are now forced into prostitution, and how all the shelves in the stores are empty. So tell us about how serious the situation is.
Well, if you look at the macroeconomic statistics of our Venezuelan economy today, the inflation rate in Venezuela has hit 80,000%. That means the price of a good has gone up by 800 times in a span of a year. So essentially, Venezuelan economy is suffering from hyperinflation like the one that Germany suffered during the interwar period in the early 20th century. So that has led to price control, which has exacerbated the shortage problem in the domestic sector. 85% of the medicine that's required for Venezuelan population is lacking. It's not there. So it shows that the Venezuelan economy has essentially collapsed because of inflation and price controls, and also as the declining oil revenue, as Professor Jimenez Morales has just described. It actually has led to a huge-scale humanitarian crisis, as well as refugee crisis, because many Venezuelan people, not just the lower class, but then the middle-class Venezuelans have been driven to leave the country to neighboring countries. And now, right now, as you have mentioned before, there are 3 million Venezuelans living in a very precarious situation.
This is why they call this country a failed state, something that we cannot really identify which country it really is. But how about U.S. humanitarian aid? Some people call it the Trojan horse, and why is that?
I think the reason why some people might be skeptical of U.S. assistance to Venezuela is because U.S. assistance often comes with requirements, comes with like terms attached, and such as demanding an improvement in the political situation, the human rights situation, and then essentially trying to influence the policy-making process of the country that receives the aid. And we know that the Venezuelan government has a very different set of priorities right now, and doesn't want to, give up the power it has. It's at loghead with the National Assembly, which is probably the only legitimate political body right now in Venezuela. So if this government had to accept the U.S. assistance at this point, then they'll have to change many of these policies, and that could lead to not just the collapse of the regime, but then we cannot guarantee the safety of the President Nicolas Maduro, but as you can imagine, he has many political enemies in terms of economic mismanagement and political repression.
So we continue our discussion with an expert in Florida. Joining us now is Eduardo Kamara, professor of political science and international relations at Florida International University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Maduro was re-elected as the country's leader last year, albeit controversial. What is the local sentiment like in Venezuela regarding the recent political situation? Would you also say it's heavily divided?
Well, it's heavily divided, no doubt. And I would say that, almost 4 million Venezuelans, depending on who you ask, have already voted in another way. They've simply left the country, either by air or have just simply walked out of Venezuela. So that's one element of public opinion. Then if you look at public opinion polls, and I'm a pollster and I've done polling in Venezuela in the past, roughly I would say about 80% of the average Venezuelans does not support the Maduro regime. And so there's that 15 to 20% that represents sort of a hardcore support for Maduro, for the program that they have been implementing over the last now 20 years.
Some critics say, though, that this is U.S. intervention of Venezuela's internal politics. So why is this, and how much influence does the U.S. have over Venezuela and the current crisis in the country?
Well, look, I think it's pretty clear that the U.S. is interested in an outcome in Venezuela that at least is not dominated by Russia, China, and by Cuba. One of the most important factors to understand about Venezuela is that over the last 20 years, Cuba has been an incredibly important actor. They dominate the intelligence service. They basically have dominated the military as well. And in essence, if there's a country that's important in Venezuela, it's Cuba, right? And so in some measure, we're reliving the Cold War to a certain extent. Although, today it's hard to call Russia a leftist country. It's further to the right than Donald Trump. But these are national interests that are at stake. And so is the U.S. interested in an outcome in Venezuela? Yes. How much of an influence does it have right now? It has zero influence over Maduro, and a lot of influence over the opposition, because in fact it's been U.S. leadership that has led to, first and foremost, the continuity of the assembly, right, of the legal assembly, and it's also led in some measure to the swearing in of Guaido as the constitutional president of Venezuela. So, in a nutshell, is this a U.S. conspiracy? No, it's a deterioration of a situation that really can't get any worse.
Thank you. That was Professor Eduardo Kamara, expert in Latin American politics based in Florida. Dr. Go, what did you think about the analysis of Professor Kamara?
Oh, I couldn't agree more with Professor Kamara's analysis of the current situation, as well as the U.S. national interest in Venezuela, in expectation to see a positive outcome there. And I think the reason why the United States is so interested in seeing a positive outcome to this, it goes beyond the humanitarian purposes, stabilizing the political and economic crisis. It also would like to see lessening of the Chinese and Russian influence in the region. Venezuela, not just with Nicolas Maduro, but starting with his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, started something called the Bolivarian Revolution in the country, which internally meant socialist reformation of the economy and politics, but externally meant Venezuela's alignment with Cuba, and then beyond Cuba would be Russia and China, and try to create an anti-American front in Latin America. So, and then for that purpose, Venezuela used its petrodollars and petroleum reserves as a weapon and as a leverage to gain favor and then create friends in the region. So I think the United States right now, given the political situation in the world, where we are seeing an increasing divide between United States and European Union on one hand, and China and Russia on the other hand, democratic states on one hand, and you could say the authoritarian regimes on the other hand. So I think in a political landscape like this, Venezuela has to become a clashing point, I would say, between the two forces. And that's the reason why I think the United States would like to secure a positive outcome for the United States and for the people of Venezuela, and really turn back the tide of increasing Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America.
Whether economic interest or diplomatic interest, really the situation now in Venezuela is very unfortunate. It's really terrible. So this situation should end. Do you think the next administration, whoever it is, will be normalizing the situation and then call the Venezuelans who are everywhere else around the globe now?
I think that we are really reaching the climax of the political crisis in Venezuela. The key question here is how the Venezuelan military are going to act from now on. If the Venezuelan military, which is very, very much captured by the political system in Venezuela that Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro have built, are going to change their mind and then, support the opposition instead, then we are going to see an end to this crisis very quickly. But if the military, they try to preserve their interest in the economic area and the political areas, then it's going to be very difficult for Venezuela to transition peacefully to a more stable situation. So this is anyone's guess, but then we are seeing hopeful signs that we're going to have a peaceful end. And so we have to hope for the best at this moment.
Great. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
The citizens of Venezuela have been caught in the crossfire between the power struggle of its two presidents and the economic interests of various external forces. It remains to be seen how the crisis will play out, especially amid the possibility of a U.S. military intervention that has been raised by some experts. That's all we have for this week's The Point World Affairs. Thank you for tuning in and see you again next week.